welcome to the Public Justice Center's next installment of our Justice for Breakfast series. This one's going to be focused on dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, how advocates in Maryland are working to keep kids in school. It'll be hosted or presented by our Education Stability Project, and I'll let those folks introduce themselves shortly. As some of you may or may not know, the Public Justice Center has multiple projects working on a number of different issues in Maryland and beyond, focused on economic equity and racial justice. And we primarily used legal impact tools and advocacy and know your rights education to accomplish our goals. Real quickly, I want to say thank you this morning to our staff, of course, our board, our volunteers, our community partners that are on the call, certainly our funders and donors, which makes a lot of this, most of this possible, and of course our other stakeholders and community members who work with us in the community to accomplish a lot of good things. So in order to save time this morning, I just want to ask if you would like to introduce yourself. Please put your name, your preferred pronouns, and your affiliation in the chat so that we can save times on introductions and those types of things. So what we'll have this morning is a presentation by members of the Education Stability Project with time for Q&A at the end. And just some real quick save the dates. Our annual report is to the printer, near the printer, getting very close to the printer at this point. So please expect to see that or notice that in your inboxes in mid-November. And then we've also already scheduled our next Justice for Breakfast series install in December 6th. And this one's going to be focused on medical debt, presented by our Health and Benefits Equity Project. And it's going to be focused on prioritizing patients over profit and the medical debt crisis in Maryland. So put a pin in your calendar for that. But if you've gotten communications from us so far, you'll get an update about RSVPing and all that good stuff here shortly. And I think I've hit all my high points for this morning. Again, I want to say welcome. And with that, I'll turn it over to Levi, Bradford, and Kelsey Carlson, the folks that'll be presenting from our Ed Stability Project this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Janice. Hey, everybody. I appreciate y'all being here with us today and stepping in to learn a little bit about the school-to-prison pipeline and what we're doing to work against it at the PJC. Let me start. I think we should start by introducing ourselves. My name's Levi Bradford. I'm a staff attorney at the Education Stability Project here at the Public Justice Center. The Education Stability Project, for y'all, is it's a project here at the center where we advance racial equity in public education by combating the use of exclusionary discipline like suspension and expulsion, school-based arrests. These practices that disproportionately target Black and brown children and push kids out of school. Previously, I was a public defender in Gainesville, Florida. You may see some of that come in throughout the presentation. It informs some of my perspective on students' rights and how we advocate for them. I'm joined today by my paralegal, Kelsey, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Good morning. My name is Kelsey Carlson. I'm a paralegal under Levi at the Ed Stability Project. I graduated Syracuse University 2021, and then I volunteered for the Lutheran Volunteer Corps for a year doing racial justice and social justice work. Take it away, Levi.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to go over a little roadmap today about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to start off by covering the school to prison pipeline, what what that is, what factors contribute to the school to prison pipeline. And then we're going to transition into talking about what the school to prison pipeline looks like in Maryland today, who it primarily affects. And we have a bunch of data that we've been compiling over the last year, just about who's getting kicked out of school and who's facing the brunt of the school to prison pipeline. Then we're going to, I hope to lay out for y'all what I believe to be an increasingly punitive landscape that students find themselves in. Just going to cover what events that have happened recently in Maryland and changes that are occurring in our schools and our communities. That means students are risking discipline more frequently, getting kicked out of school more easily, and higher rates of arrest. And then I want to talk a little bit about how this last year we advocated for students' rights in the legislative session in Annapolis, what that experience was like, and whether we had any success there. But the important part of today's presentation that I want to spend the most time on, if we can, is a question, which is how do you advocate for students, particularly students in minority groups, when political winds are against the progress for students' rights? So this is not a question that I really have an answer to, but it's a discussion that I hope to contribute to through the presentation. And afterward, I hope to transition us into a broader discussion to brainstorm together ways to fight for students in our modern political landscape. One of my favorite writers and activists, Mariame Kaba, said, we must imagine an experiment with new collective structures that enable us to take more principled action. I know the people that are here today are from across the broad spectrum of legal advocates, education advocates in the education world, working with students directly or otherwise involved in the community in Maryland. And one of the most important tools that we have for advocating for others, for students, is connecting and collectively acting and learning from each other about how to fight for the advancement of students' rights together. At the end, we're going to have opportunities, y'all to ask us questions, us to ask y'all some questions, and have that broader discussion. So first, I'm going to pass it back to Kelsey to go over the school to prison pipeline and lay out what factors make up that pipeline.
Thanks, Levi. So the school to prison pipeline, what do we know? Students who are overpunished, secluded, and excluded are more likely to touch the criminal legal system. It disproportionately affects Black and Brown students, even though research shows that they demonstrate no more worse behaviors than their white peers. It also disproportionately affects students with disabilities who are removed from school most often due to a manifestation of their disability. Removals from the classroom lead to a poor academic performance, increased dropout rates, and increased chance of criminal legal involvement. A student who has been suspended or expelled for discretionary violations is 3 times more likely to encounter the juvenile legal system in the next year. So how does the school to prison pipeline reflect the criminal legal system? It is a high control environment with metal detectors sometimes, restrictions on behaviors, when they can move about, when they can eat. Students are removed from their school community through suspensions and expulsions, which emulates the way defendants are incarcerated and removed from their communities. Administrators respond to parents' demands for justice, similarly to the way that prosecutors respond to victims' demand for justice. They also experience lasting unseen consequences. They fall behind in their coursework. They're stuck with a discipline record that can follow them throughout the course of their education. Because of these similarities, advocates have recognized the need for due process protections for students, similar to protections due to criminal defendants. In Maryland, students and families have the opportunity to prevent evidence and the ability to appeal. However, they do not have the right to a judge, a jury, an attorney, and the burden of proof can often end up on them.
Thanks, Kelsey. I want to pause for a second while we're talking about the school to prison pipeline and make it clear that, student behavior challenges are real issues in the classroom that should be addressed. Just because we, at the Public Justice Center work against exclusionary discipline does not mean that we don't think, does not mean that we think that student behavior issues shouldn't be addressed at all. But exclusionary discipline practices like suspension, expulsion, and school-based arrest aren't effective ways to do that. Removing a kid from a school doesn't address the cause of their behavior. It doesn't teach them how to behave well. And research shows it doesn't actually make schools any safer. So on top of that, we think about the kid themselves who is being pushed out of school. They face direct harms by being removed from their community and falling behind in coursework and losing classroom time. Now let me cover what the school to prison pipeline looks like. Let's explore kind of who the pipeline is impacting. This first chart right here, this is all data that comes straight from the Maryland State Department of Education and some from the Department of Juvenile Services. This first chart here is, it shows which school districts are suspending or expelling the most kids. For the 2021-2022 school year is the most recent data we have. Last year, the state average across Maryland, which is, I don't know if y'all can see my mouse down here, was that schools issued about 1 suspension for every 15 kids they had enrolled. You can see that Baltimore County right up here had about 1 in 10, one suspension issued for every 10 kids. So they're usually more frequently than the state average. But you can see above Baltimore the outliers. These are all, if y'all are familiar with Maryland geography, these are all Eastern Shore counties. Somerset and Dorchester both issue about 1 suspension for every 3 students. Keep in mind there is some variability with Somerset and Dorchester are small districts, so they're the data is prone to these spikes. But it still is large portions of the student body in a bunch of these Eastern Shore counties and even in Baltimore County receiving suspensions and being removed from school. So this kind of shows you geographically who's getting suspended or expelled in Maryland. These charts are to show you that every county in Maryland has a problem with racial disparities in suspension and expulsion. This bottom chart here shows every single county in Maryland, the population of Black students in these outline bars, and then the bars that are above, those Black outline bars. That's how the portion of suspensions that are going to Black students in Maryland. So you can see in every single county except maybe one, there is a problem of over discipline. Black children in Maryland on average are about twice as likely, they're 4 times as likely as white students to get suspended or expelled, but they're receiving suspensions at about twice the rate that they enroll. You'd expect if they're receiving, proportionate discipline, equal discipline, they would be at this 1.0. They're receiving suspensions or expulsions directly in line with how many Black students are enrolled. But that's not the case in every single county, except maybe Garrett. We have some suspicions about the data from Garrett County, but everybody else has the same problem. No one is exempt from the racial disparities we see in school discipline. The same goes for students with disabilities. This is the same charts. These are the population of students with disabilities in Maryland. About 12 to 12.5% of students they have some disability. However, about more than 25%, more than a quarter of suspensions or expulsions go to students with disabilities. So it's a little more than twice the rate that they ought to be receiving suspension or expulsions at. So again, every county in Maryland has this issue of over discipline of students with disabilities as well as Black students. This chart is to show you that there are some specific small parts of Maryland at specific schools where the school to prison pipeline is alive and well, so much so that at these schools, all of these are schools who gave more or as many suspensions to Black students as they had Black students enrolled at their school in the last year. Maces Lane Middle School down in Dorchester, they issued 427 suspensions to Black students. They only had 354 Black students enrolled. That means, on average, if you are a Black student at this school, on average, every single one of them is receiving a suspension. Now, what these numbers mean is that there are several students who are getting repeated suspensions. That's kind of a problem with the data that we have to try and play with to get the full picture of what's going on. But this is a huge number. This is more than 100% suspension to enrollment ratio. So it's clear that the school to prison pipeline is alive and well in Maryland. One thing that I like to, that I like pointing out is I come from Florida. Down there, the school to prison pipeline is also very alive and well. I think it's important to remind, especially advocates and when we live in a state that is ostensibly progressive and democratic, that we are not exempt from being critical and fixing the racial disparities that occur in our institutions. Just because Maryland fancies itself progressive does not mean it is free of the problems of racial disparities, and still needs to be addressed just like everywhere else. I want to talk for a bit about the social and political atmosphere that kids in Maryland are experiencing right now. Over the last decade, advocates in Maryland have made some great strides towards more constructive environments, ones that rely less on exclusionary discipline and more on inclusive, restorative approaches. Give myself some water for a second. You can tell I tend to talk a lot and don't really catch my breath when I should. Yeah, so we made a good progress in the last decade, advancing students' rights. There was very notably in 2014, Maryland State Board of Education passed new discipline regulations that protect students through the zealous application of due process. Like Kelsey was saying, much like defendants in criminal courts, to make sure that students, to try and discourage the use of exclusionary discipline and try and solve behavior challenges inside the school instead of just pushing kids out. That progress has hit a bump in the road, and it might be more than just a bump, actually. Advocates for education equity and students' rights have begun to see a shift in political momentum in Maryland, and honestly across the country. One person working in Maryland schools told us about the attitude of school boards and administrators. Everyone wants to move backwards to harsh discipline regimes that make it easier to expel kids. And one way that's happening is through the revision of codes of conduct that allow for more severe punishments. So every school district in Maryland has a code of conduct that it lays out various offenses, tells you how many what kinds of interventions that administrators should be using, and a lot of them set like maximum responses. A kid who is misusing a phone, like has their phone out during class. A lot of these codes of conduct will put a maximum, like we're not going to allow suspension of that kid. You can maybe do in-school suspension if it's really bad. That kind of thing. That's what these codes of conduct do, and they guide administrators in how to issue discipline. I am going to, but this last year, codes of conduct are being revised in a couple of school districts, allowing for more severe punishments and sometimes allowing for punishments of younger and younger children than previously. I'm going to let Kelsey tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Levi. So what we're looking at is for Baltimore City Schools. And you can see across the board things that warranted a 3-day max suspension are now available for an expulsion. This was revised just this school year, so counties are moving backwards. Unintentionally hitting a staff member, 3 days maximum, now expulsion. Couple kids, rough housing, one flings their arm out, accidentally hits a teacher, expulsion is now on the table. In the next slide, you can see the same thing for PG County. Things that used to be ISS only are now eligible for expulsion. False alarm, that's yelling fire when there is none, pulling the fire alarm. These are teachable moments. Taking them out of the school population doesn't teach the students that this was the wrong, incorrect thing to do.
Yeah, students are beginning to face harsher punishments at school here in Maryland, and this backwards slide towards, favoring making it easier to suspend or expel kids rather than making it harder. That slide is also manifested in calls for return to zero tolerance policies. We've seen this from Montgomery County recently, and a couple of parent groups are advocating for a return to zero tolerance, which is a discipline policy that Maryland used to have back in the early 2010s, where students were suspended or expelled just based on the offense. If the behavior of a student met the threshold to be called a certain offense, they were suspended or expelled automatically, no matter the context. The zero tolerance policies in Maryland are illegal, and they've also been proven to be ineffective at actually making schools any safer or changing behavior. In the juvenile justice realm, we've begun to hear this refrain over and over again. We need to hold kids accountable, particularly from prosecutors who are advocating for the repeal of two laws to protect children, two laws that are designed to protect children in the juvenile legal system. These are the Child Interrogation Protection Act, which protects children from coercive interrogation by police, and the Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 2022, which, among other things, puts limits on the severity of sentences kids can get for some charges. One of the reasons I'm including this is because when they say we need to hold kids accountable, it becomes clear what they mean is they want the ability to charge kids more frequently with juvenile offenses and give them longer sentences. This is the landscape that our children find themselves in. Another factor here that's making kids' environments more punitive are the curfews we saw last year. Cities in Maryland and all across the country instituted youth curfews despite consistent evidence that curfews don't curb youth crime. We saw this in Baltimore City, Prince George's County, and Cambridge. This is also a national event. Like there were cities all across the country that did this. Baltimore City, what we saw was it essentially acted as a response to what the public saw as a spike in youth crime. There was a violent incident down by the harbor that really spurred the city instituting a curfew. The results of that were no substantial decrease in youth crime. All it did was make it, Baltimore City was trying to do it well and not make it super illegal for kids to be on the streets. They wanted to put them in, pick them up and take them to community events or community centers. But the message that we send to kids when we give them curfews is that we don't trust them. Their autonomy their autonomy and freedom of movement is restricted. And it adds to this overall environment that, shows that we are moving towards favoring discipline and restriction for kids rather than honoring their autonomy and personhood. And this all comes in a national political environment where we see book bans and regular attacks on the autonomy of trans students. The message from the most conservative ends of the political spectrum is that children's identities and learning materials ought to be restricted. And while at the beginning of all these, at the beginning of these demands and protests, the attacks on trans student rights and the book bans, it at first struck a lot of people as like, this is nuts. This is never going to happen. But we saw a lot of school districts over the last year, particularly in the South, but it's happening up north too, concede to these demands to take books off shelves, to restrict the kind of access that children have to learning materials. The message, the message is just that, sometimes I start a sentence, I'm going to move on. I'm getting myself tripped up. Okay. So it has become less and less politically popular to support students' rights and autonomy. All those factors that I just went over, not only are the evidence that the pendulum is shifting towards discipline and punitive measures for children, away from protecting students' rights and autonomy, and protecting them from overly harsh discipline that would exclude them from schools. I'm having this thing this morning where it's just leaving my brain, but it's become. Oh, I got it. Not only were all those things that I just went over, not only were they evidence that we've shifted this mindset, but they are also things that themselves exacerbate that the community mindset around whether we should be favoring harsher discipline, holding kids more accountable, or protecting their right to be in schools. They are themselves evidence and also factors pushing that pendulum further the other direction. We saw this effect become true in the Maryland State Legislature this last year. Kelsey's going to talk to you about 2 bills that we were supporting this year and 3 that we were working to defeat, and they all in some way demonstrate this attitude shift.
Thanks, Levi. So the first is the Decriminalized Disturbing Schools Activities Bill, which would have amended the Maryland Code of Education, wherein it makes it a crime to willfully disturb or otherwise willfully prevent the orderly conduct of school, so that the prohibition would no longer apply to students, decriminalizing typical childhood and adolescent behavior. While we had some interest in this bill from legislators in the past couple years, the willpower to get it passed has dwindled this past year. Another bill we supported, SB 812. Students' school transcripts follow them to college and beyond, influencing their opportunities and access to further education. This bill would have been a first step in mitigating the effects of suspensions and expulsions on school records, but was withdrawn by the sponsor at the last minute. The final 3 were bills that we opposed and that we had done written and oral testimony against. HB 1190, we want to keep students away from the legal system, not increase their opportunity to encounter it. HB 203, for the same reasons that we support SB 812, we oppose HB 203. Students' records follow them wherever they go, and a removal for a reportable offense is a particularly stigmatized removal. This bill would have put students' right to a free and public education at risk. HB 69 penalized parents rather than focusing on the accountability of schools in providing access to counseling to every student, never offering financial assistance, and never ensuring that they would be providing free of charge counseling services. While we agree that counseling can be very valuable to a student, we also believe that the inevitable results of this bill would have been that many lower income parents would have been unable to comply with the counseling requirements and face conviction as a result.
One thing I want to point out about the first bill is Decriminalized Disturbing School Activities Bill. Like Kelsey said, I think we first introduced it in 2022. There could have been one in 2021, but 2022, this bill passed both the House and the Senate. The issue with it was a technical one. The reason why it's not currently law, why we didn't repeal that part of the education code is because the way those bills both passed were they were slightly different, so they had to be reconciled. They missed a deadline. So it was like 1 year where there was a technical issue. We had to come back next year and get it passed that year with all the technical issues sorted out. We did. We brought it back the next year to, it should have been a simple, like, this is the same bill everybody approved last year. We just need to pass it as a formality. We came back in 2023 with it, and there was so much less political will to push it through, to approve it. And it's because between the early 2022 session and the early 2023 session, there's this mindset has shifted. It is not politically popular, even for Democrats, to push for protections, against students being excluded from school, or arrested for, disturbing school activities. The push now that we see is legislators are trying to, maybe not legislators. The push is to give administrators and principals more powers to exclude kids from school, to prioritize their ability to met out discipline however they see fit. And now, coming to the upcoming 2024 session, we've heard from multiple places that there is just no political will for bills that advance students' rights. We anticipate this upcoming year being a defensive one, where we see bills coming down the pike that are going to be restricting the freedoms of students and making it easier for administrators, like I said, to exclude kids through suspension or expulsion. So we've covered a lot. The political wind has shifted away from supporting students' rights to, as I said, supporting the ability of administrators to discipline kids, and to discipline kids in a way that results in them getting pushed out of school. So let's get back to that question that I asked at the beginning of the presentation. How do we as advocates continue to promote the autonomy and power of students in this political environment? Well, first, one of the things that we're doing is we're utilizing reforms from the past to help protect students' rights now. In 2014, the Maryland State Board of Education, I explained this early in the presentation, the State Board of Education revamped all the discipline regulations to provide a more robust due process when districts want to suspend or expel a kid. The hope is that these procedures and the due process means that only the kids who have to be excluded in order to keep a safe school environment are excluded, and everybody else is included. And that schools aren't using discipline processes to just exclude, problem kids who are exhibiting challenging behaviors, but are not actually a threat to anybody. They're just, kids you have to learn how to raise and work with and teach well. We as advocates, we work to make sure districts are following these laws, primarily through direct representation right now. Even if politically it's unpopular to keep kids who have behavioral challenges in school, schools are still beholden to following the laws that are already in place. And one of the primary ways that we, particularly like lawyers, do that is by holding schools to those laws, by representing kids in suspension, expulsion proceedings, and also in special education proceedings. There are particular federal special education protections when schools want to suspend or expel a kid who has a special education plan. The IDEA, or the Rehabilitation Act, they help keep students with disabilities in school. They keep schools accountable to their duty to provide other ways to address student misbehavior, particularly for students who have disabilities. To replace exclusionary discipline, we as we advocate, we want to constantly be presenting the alternative methods, like not just saying, don't suspend your kids and then leave it at that, but give schools what the answer to that is. And that there are a lot of different things that could be, particularly for kids who have disabilities, robust special education plans with well-crafted behavior intervention plans. These are, I'm saying a lot of jargon in terms of art for special education law. That's why special education law is kind of its own industry, not industry, its own practice. It's a very specialized practice of law. Where was I? Oh, restorative justice. One of the primary ways that advocates have been pushing to replace exclusionary discipline is through the implementation of restorative justice. The last couple of years have seen Maryland State investing a lot in restorative practices. What that means, and to explain what I mean by restorative justice, is it's a kind of a spectrum, a set of non-punitive methods and tools for, there's a little typo there, for repairing relationships harmed by student behavior. It focuses on the relationship that's harmed and bringing a student back into a community rather than excluding them. It's an inclusive form of discipline rather than an exclusive one. Most often we see that look like, when we see restorative justice in practice, and when we look at a discipline practice and we go, that's restorative justice, often we think of mediation or restorative circles, which is just a form of mediation for a group, a very specific kind of mediation for a group. I'd recommend anyone who's interested there's a great report from the Open Society Institute here in Baltimore about Baltimore City Schools' implementation of restorative practices over the last couple of years, their successes, and how important it is that we start using these discipline methods to help raise up kids in good behavior while also keeping them in school and in the classroom to learn. Let me see. Where is it? Probably the most boring mechanism that we use, that it's incredibly useful and helpful still, are the various state and federal complaint processes to push back when school districts are violating student discipline or special education rights. The Maryland State Department of Education is one of the primary methods we use here at the Public Justice Center. They have authority over school districts as like the state like designated education agency. So they actually have the power to they can direct districts to put a kid back in class, to train their staff and administrators on the law and how to follow the law, but they also have the power to withhold funding. The way that the funding mechanisms work is that every school district in Maryland gets money from the federal government for their special education programs, and the State Department of Education, they have the authority when a district is not abiding by those federal laws. And if they're pushing kids out who are have special education plans and should be in school, if they're pushing kids out unlawfully, the State Department has the State Department of Education has the authority to withhold funds from them. Although I don't see them do that very often, but it just shows the kind of power they have over districts. So they have a complaint process we use a lot to when a district won't comply with the law, the State Department of Education is a little removed from that, and I think removed a little bit more from the political environment that we find ourselves in, and has been willing to find that districts have violated student rights and how direct school districts to put those kids back in schools. There's also several ways that we can make federal complaints that advocates do sometimes, but we primarily keep it in state complaint procedures. As I wrap up, I want to call out a few victories and creative solutions from outside Maryland to kind of demonstrate the ways that other advocates are finding, I think of it as creative solutions to some sticky problems in students' rights, and especially in like discipline, in the area of discipline. this first one is there was a case case from Sacramento that just this last year, I think, came to a settlement, and I think it's a pretty creative settlement. Over the allegation was that the district was administering school discipline in a racially disproportionate way. That kids of color were experiencing more harsh punishments than white kids in Sacramento.
Make it a little stronger.
With the thing I think is cool about this is kind of the thing I think is creative is that the settlement was the district and the plaintiffs have to agree on in some version of an independent monitor, bringing a completely independent party to assess the district and its the methods it uses to issue suspensions and expulsions, and special education placements and bullying and harassment, and come up with a plan to fix those disparities. To have what they did is they had an independent party develop a plan that the school district had to abide by in order to address the underlying allegations of the case. The other one that I think is an exciting development that I think we should be paying more attention to is there's a national movement right now that is, I think it was burgeoning, but it might be well in full swing, to make literacy a fundamental or a civil right. The underlying premise of the legal aspect of it is that voting is a fundamental right in the United States, and literacy is a base form of education that every citizen needs in order to vote effectively. There was a settlement, there was a lawsuit and then a settlement outside of Detroit that very nearly successfully got literacy and base level of education declared a fundamental right in Michigan. Was a federal circuit court, so that would have been a federal finding. That one resulted in a settlement, but the power of that lawsuit was remarkable, and I think something we should be paying more attention to as advocates. The non-legal side of this is that the NAACP is starting a campaign around the right to read and literacy as a right, around the methods that schools use to teach literacy, to try and advocate for more effective ways to give kids access to reading and literacy. So literacy as a civil right is taking as far as I've seen, at least two prongs. There's legal moments happening with it, but there's also some on the ground work being done to look at reading curriculums to make sure that students have that right. And this last little one, this year, we previously talked about how at the Public Justice Center we've been trying to push this bill to decriminalize the act of disrupting school activities, particularly for kids who are in those schools, making it so they can't be arrested for disrupting their own school. There was a similar law in South Carolina that the circuit court out in South Carolina found to be unconstitutionally vague, because the language of disrupting school was not nearly strong enough. Not nearly specific enough to let anyone know what is actually illegal under that standard. The fun part is the Fourth Circuit that decided this court case incorporates Maryland. So we have a very similar law as to South Carolina, and it's possible that this decision declaring the South Carolina law unconstitutionally vague could apply to our law that we've been trying to repeal, or the criminal portion that we've been trying to repeal. As far as I know, that court case has not been filed yet, but I think it's a possible avenue that advocates could take to try and address one way that kids are being taken out of school through school-based arrest. And at the end here, I want to just call out a couple advocates in Maryland who are doing great work. Because one of the things that I think is our best tool for supporting students' rights and fighting for racial equity in education is that we should all get connected and we should all work together and we should all share resources and be, I have no doubt that everyone involved in the education world is here for the kids. We should get on the same page about that and work together so that we can actually fight for kids' rights and autonomy and their success in school. Young People for Progress outside of Montgomery County is doing great work. They just relaunched their campaign to decriminalize Montgomery County. The Manerius Dream Alliance on the Eastern Shore is doing incredible advocacy in pretty much every county on the Eastern Shore, along with mentorship of young Black kids. The Youth as Resources is right here in Baltimore City. They are a group. They're actually a formalized group of students who advocate for students' rights from a student perspective. They're great, and I highly recommend going. They have a school police roundtable every month that is a great discussion and about what's going on in Baltimore and how we can help prevent kids from getting kicked out of school through like school-based arrest. There are many, many more advocates in Maryland that I want to know about. There's no way that I could be connected with and know everything that's going on in Maryland. If you know more organizations or advocates that are doing good work, I want to know them, I want to meet them, and I want us all to connect over that. So let me know. Okay, I'm gonna take myself a second. Again, I really appreciate y'all sitting with me while I kind of got on my soapbox for a minute. I want to open up the floor to questions for me and Kelsey, but I also want to pose a question to y'all. So feel free to chime in with your question or your answer to my question, which is, what ways have you seen to be effective in advancing or protecting students' rights and education equity in the last, what have you seen anything recently that seems to be working, that seems to honor the autonomy of students and promote, racial equity in education and also equity for students with disabilities? It's another population we should be paying attention to as well. So again, thank you for sticking around for me. And now, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can, just raise your hand and chime in. I'll open that up now, unless my executive director has anything to say about that.
All right, we have a couple questions in the chat, Levi. The first of which is from Lisa Fernberg. She says, is there a particular role for the parents of non-disciplined students to play in this advocacy? I imagine and can see myself, a parent of a first grader, a potential inclination towards the perspective of get these problem kids out of my kid's classroom. But how can the issue be reframed to reduce their protect my own kid fear perspective?
This is a great question. And I'm gonna need a minute to think about it, because one of my skills is not thinking on my feet. But let me come back to this question when I have. I'm sure I have a good answer for this. It's not coming to my head right now.
Okay, we have a couple in the chat. So Sabrina Harris asked, what support systems do parents have to help them to navigate through the school punitive process and provide supports to their children who may have behavioral issues?
If you have a kid who's getting pushed out, suspended, or expelled, or has behavioral issues, there are a couple of avenues and a couple of advocates to engage with. One of the major organizations to look to is Disability Rights Maryland. They are a they are a state designated organization to help advance the well-being of anyone with disabilities. They have a robust education wing that works on IEPs, special education processes, and if your kid has behavioral issues that may be related to special education, if you have any, if you suspect that at all, I would engage Disability Rights Maryland somehow. If they can't represent you directly, they can give you some technical assistance. The other thing, this is a great opportunity. Where's my website? This is a good opportunity to plug our project. So we at the Public Justice Center partner with a couple organizations across Maryland and other advocates with the Office of the Public Defender, with Disability Rights Maryland, and with a couple of the law school clinics we formed a project called the Maryland Suspension Representation Project. The hope is to get kids who are getting pushed out of school unlawfully to get those kids represented by attorneys. We have an intake line, we have a website, and if you have any suspicions that your kid's being pushed out of school unlawfully, I would suggest hitting up that website, giving us a call. We might be able to give you technical assistance or advice, even if we can't represent you. Let's see. Kelsey, can you put the number in the website in the chat?
Yep, I can do that.
That'd be great.
And the next question you had was from Diana Phillip, who asked, do we have any targeted advocacy campaign for educational equity for foster care youth in home and congregate care?
Let me think. So the Public Justice Center used to focus more on foster care youth in education settings. I know that there is I did a training for God, who is the organization? There's they're like state government organizations that work with foster youth. The name's not coming to my mind, but there is, I don't know any organizations right now doing any like targeted advocacy campaign around foster care youth. One of the things that we've done recently is we engaged the state organization that the caseworkers for students for kids who are in foster care, to train them on special education, or on not special education rights, discipline rights, because foster kids are incredibly at a risk of getting pushed out of school, particularly with their home instability. So we worked on training them to be able to advocate for their kids in special education. God, I keep saying that, in discipline processes. Right now, I would say the best, I don't know any organization doing that currently, but again, the Maryland Suspension Representation Project, is a great spot, a great place if a kid in foster care is facing suspension or expulsion.
Thank you, Levi. Our next question comes from Valerie Derricks, who asked, Radical Acts of Justice by Jocelyn Simonson talked about participatory defense. Can this be used to help turn around the hostile view of kids who have discipline challenges? For example, using sociobiographical information to help with the defense of their rights.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the challenges of this work of representing students who are getting suspended or expelled is that there are not a lot of us advocates doing it in Maryland. If we had all the staff that we could possibly need, I would have the time to spend with a family. I think it would be really effective to go to suspension or expulsion proceedings, and explain to schools the context of student behavior, of any misbehavior by a child, because schools have a duty to try and address that behavior without suspension or expulsion. The school boards made it clear that that's supposed to be the last resort method, and often there are protections in the law that say you have to have tried other interventions too. So having a clear picture of a child's sociobiographical information is vital to showing schools how you can address student behavior without just excluding them. Because once you have the context, then you can help, then you can, develop what that student needs to support them in school, to support their harmony with their classmates. The way this comes up most often is that special education processes do this inherently. They incorporate a lot of information about the student to develop very specific plans for their behavior. One thing that I'll throw out is that there's a thing called a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan. This functional behavior assessment is done by a psychologist or psychiatrist, and figures out the root causes of problem behaviors, and also the context they happen in, what triggers a kid has, and it helps to develop a plan for when a child misbehaves or acts out or has a meltdown of some kind. Anyone can have one of those plans. They do not have to be on a special education plan. And I think we should be using that process more often to get kids who don't have disabilities behavior intervention plans, to just encourage schools to understand these kids more in their particular specific context and how those kids can thrive if given the correct personalized supports.
Thank you, Levi. And just to circle back to our first question, that's the final question in the group chats. And to remind you, how can the issue be reframed to reduce a parent's protect my own kid perspective versus, taking a look at the full situation?
It's tough because these the discipline systems are ones that you often you only engage with when your child's being disciplined. Most of the time they're supposed to be out of sight, out of mind. Like, you don't notice that they're happening. Or your kid's not affected by them because your kid is not having behavioral issues in school. Honestly, I think one of the best things we can be doing is pushing back on the rhetoric of when parents get caught up in we're trying what's the word I'm looking for, when parents get eager to punish other kids. I see frequently parents whose kids were hit in school, and it can become a form of crusade for that parent to make sure the other kid is punished for it. However, the more effective way of handling that is for that kid to participate in some form of restorative justice with the kid they have conflict with. Punishing that kid by suspending or expelling them doesn't solve the issue. And I think the best we can be doing right now is, one, advocating our legislators for kinder procedures that for school discipline that take into account a kid's context and favor keeping them in school to solve the issues rather than kicking them out of school. Along with advocating to legislators and particularly like local school boards, just pushing back against other parents who seek to blame kids for poor school climate and school environments, and hold schools accountable for building those good school environments where kids actually are free to live in harmony with one another. I recognize that I would love more specific answers to this question, and I may have some that I follow up with after the presentation. But it's a good question, and I think it's a hard one because, again, you don't interact with discipline processes unless your kid is getting disciplined. So other than just telling an administrator you don't like when kids get kicked out of school, how can we advocate for it as just like parents? So I may follow up with that more after the presentation.
Okay, and we have a hand raised for a question. Cuddy, go ahead.
Hey, so I work in a school in DCPS, and we've implemented restorative practices, and we've seen that, I've seen that in multiple schools, but what we're noticing is particularly for high schoolers who have a history of discipline and behavioral difficulties, there becomes a point of, okay, now just suspend me. And when we look at restorative practices, that's premised on having a strong community, because what are we restoring? We're restoring the relationships within that community. But if that community is fractured to begin with, that student doesn't feel a part of that community, or feels like they have no responsibility to that community, and are actively seeking, you know what, just give me the exclusionary 3-day, because now I get a 3-day weekend. How do you combat that? Or how do you create buy-in? Or what recourse do we have when the parent, the child, and administrators are saying, let's just suspend them?
Yeah, this is such a good question, because it's a hard one, because I think we, like advocates particularly, can get caught in like the refrain of restorative justice as the answer, when restorative justice is one tool that's supposed to try and improve school climate somewhat, but the getting a good school climate and building good relationships, and you're having like making it so students can build good relationships with each other and with the rest of their community is much more complicated than just instituting a different discipline policy. And it starts a long time before the student's actually in being disciplined for something. So I would say it's a hard one it's a hard question to answer, because the point at which a student is like, just give me the suspension, it's hard to know if you've lost them already, like if that's relationship is repairable even. So it's a good question that I hope that we would engage more, education experts on. One of the things that I'll point to, I think there is something about this in this Open Society Institute report on Baltimore City schools that I will link in the chat, because I think it's actually a good piece of information to have. Where's the chat?
Great, thank you.
Okay, Levi, and we had a quick little thought. Lisa Fernberg said, it just makes me wonder out loud whether a target of advocacy should be other parents. Legislators and school admins probably feel pressure to protect these parents and kids, but if they know those parents also don't want harsh punishments, they'd have more cover to, use lighter punishments and, keep the child in school.
Yeah, I hear from administrators a lot about when particularly more egregious offenses happen in schools, that like the parents want something to be done, want someone to be suspended, so they're gonna suspend somebody, which I don't think is a great way to met out discipline. But I agree. I think that one of the things that I think is interesting is I come from public defense, and I've worked in, worked and been, in liberal political circles for a while. But I find that the stance of we shouldn't be using exclusionary discipline is not universally held. It is to some a pretty extreme stance to take, and parents can very justifiably want to feel that their kids are safe in school and want their in the response of like, I want this kid punished is, I don't think is an incredibly wild one for parents to have, but so I think we may have a ways to go in advocating in convincing parents that the solution to when their kid gets hit at school is not to kick the other kid out, is not to punish the other kid as harshly as they can. I think that that's a good target, though, to try and be educating our community members and advocating to other parents that the response shouldn't be exclusion or harshness. It should be bringing kids back into the fold and teaching, using instances like that to teach children. Because, legislators are often not going to respond when their constituents don't want exclusionary discipline ended. We don't even, so working on the base, working on the parents of kids, I think is a great a good starting point to all this.
Okay, we'll do one last final question from Valerie Derricks. How can people like me outside of the legal or school system, but who have a desire for young people to succeed, support what you are advocating?
Let me think. There are, let's see. This should be something I have on the top of my head because I just did a presentation about a lot of ways to do that. The first one that comes to mind is getting involved with or supporting organizations like Young People for Progress in Montgomery County, like the Mid-Area Stream Alliance.
Make sure you're voting for people who are going to support education reforms in the House and the Senate, Maryland. I know I can provide information on that sort of thing, but do your best to dig.
The other thing I'll say is that a lot of people don't know that they have discipline rights, that their kids can't just be kicked out for anything. We find that when we do know your rights trainings for parents or students, we get a huge influx of cases because there's just a knowledge gap. One of the best things you can do is, if you're in your community and you know people who have kids, is to know that there is the Maryland Suspension Representation Project, or even know that person has rights to be protected, that they should explore, finding an attorney, finding legal advice, or just look up guides for it. Disability Rights Maryland has a huge amount of incredibly helpful guides for parents to advocate for themselves. I'd say just keep in your back pocket as you go throughout your life. If someone has a kid in school and they are getting kicked out, or they know someone's getting kicked out, let them know that they have rights and spread the word that they can do something about it, because that's one of our biggest issues, is just the knowledge gap. And schools use that gap to their advantage to not have to abide by the law. Not to say the schools are doing everything in poor, in like bad faith, but that gap can mean the kids get kicked out unlawfully a lot. Yeah, Kadeem, I completely agree with your thing, the thing you put in the chat, which I'll read out just because I think it's important, that in a society built on low-road radical capitalism, racial capitalism, the only form of accountability that has existed are punitive measures. It's going to take a big mindset shift for this kind of work to become mainstream. Prison abolition is still pretty niche, for instance. Yeah, absolutely. Our stance is by no means the popular stance. We back it up. We have research. We have good reasons why we want to end the use of exclusionary discipline and instead foster healthy communities in schools. And it's going to take a lot of work to get us to a place where legislators start responding to this position. But while it's politically unpopular still, we're going to keep doing our work in schools and representing kids in front of school boards, in front of superintendents, in front of the state school board, to the State Department of Education, all the ways that we do it. So yeah, I appreciate everyone's time. I know we're getting close to time here, and I don't want to keep everybody, but I'm again, thank you for taking your time with us this morning.
Yep, thanks everyone. It was good to see you all. Thanks to Levi and Kelsey for their wonderfully in-depth presentation. As with any of our Justice for Breakfast presentations or any of our Know Your Rights educations or anything you see on our website, we're here to field questions if we can. That's going to be very general questions about like we talked about today, but if you're having specific issues around school discipline, please feel free to reach out to us. And if we will do our best to put you into connection with folks that can help with your particular situation, based on our network and the folks we work with in partnership on this issue in particular. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Hope to see you all in December for our next Justice for Breakfast, when we talk about, again, the prioritizing patients over profits and the medical debt crisis in Maryland. So again, good morning. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Have a great day.